The last thing I remember before everything went dark was the sound of crunching metal and the smell of burnt rubber on wet asphalt. It was a Tuesday in late October. I was driving back from the hardware store on Highway 17, just outside Sudbury, the kind of gray afternoon where the sky sits low and heavy and you can feel the first real cold of the season. Coming in through the vents, a pickup truck ran a red light at the intersection near La Sella Boulevard and hit me on the driver's side. Just like that. 1 second I was thinking about whether I'd bought enough weather stripping for the garage door. The next second there was nothing. I woke up in Health Sciences North with 3 cracked ribs, a fractured left wrist, and a deep gash above my eyebrow that took 11 stitches to close. The doctor, a young woman who spoke quietly and looked like she hadn't slept in 2 days, told me I'd been unconscious for about 4 hours. She said I was lucky. People said that a lot in the days that followed. Lucky. I kept turning the word over in my mind like a stone that didn't quite fit in your palm. My name is Gordon. I'm 63 years old. I retired 2 years ago from 31 years as a site supervisor with a construction company out of Greater Sudbury. I built things for most of my adult life. Roads, bridges, a few municipal buildings I still drive past sometimes and feel something I can't quite name. My wife Margaret passed 8 years ago from ovarian cancer, and after that it was just me and my son Nathan, and whatever we could make of the shape our family had become. Nathan was 40 when all this happened. He worked in commercial real estate in Toronto, flew up to see me, maybe twice a year, called on birthdays, Christmas, Father's Day if he remembered. We weren't estranged exactly, I wouldn't have used that word, but there was a distance between us that had been growing so slowly for so long that I'd almost stopped noticing it, the way you stop noticing a crack in the ceiling until one day a piece of plaster lands on your kitchen table. His wife, Renee, I never fully understood. She was polite to my face in the way that people are polite when they've made a decision about you and are just waiting for the right time to act on it. When the hospital called Nathan the evening of my accident, he drove up from Toronto. Arrived around midnight. I was conscious by then, sore and exhausted and genuinely glad to see him walk through that door. He looked tired, still in his work clothes, and he sat down next to my bed and asked me what had happened. I told him. He nodded. He stayed for maybe 40 minutes. Before he left, he stood at the foot of my bed and looked at me with an expression I still have trouble describing. Not angry, not sad, something more like inconvenienced. He said, "You know, Dad, this is the 3rd time in 2 years something like this has happened with you. The fall on the back steps, then the chest scare, and now this." I said, "Nathan, I was hit by a truck." "That's not really something I could have." He said, I know. I'm just saying, you're getting to an age where maybe you shouldn't be driving alone on the highway in October. Maybe it's time to think about your situation." I didn't say anything. I didn't know what to say. I was lying in a hospital bed with my ribs taped and my wrist in a splint, and my son was telling me I was becoming a situation. He left around 1 in the morning, said he had an early call with a client in Vancouver, said he'd be in touch, said to call if I needed anything. He didn't come back. For the next 4 days I lay in that ward and watched the other beds fill and empty. The man in the bed across from mine had a hip replacement, and his whole family descended on him, daughter, son-in-law, 3 grandkids who were too loud for a hospital. But nobody seemed to care, and watching them, I felt something in my chest that had nothing to do with the cracked ribs. The nurse who looked after me most mornings was a woman named Deb. She was probably 55, sharp-eyed, moved through the ward like she'd been doing this for 30 years because she had. She brought me a coffee from the good machine down the hall on my 2nd morning, the kind of small gesture you don't forget. She asked about my work, my wife, my life. She sat on the edge of the chair next to my bed for 10 minutes when her shift allowed it and just talked to me like I was a person. That sounds like a low bar. It wasn't. On the 3rd day, my daughter-in-law Renee called my cell. I thought maybe Nathan had asked her to check in. Instead, she said, very casually, as if she were asking me about the weather, that she and Nathan had been talking and they thought it might be a good time for me to think about listing the house on Paquette Street. I said, "I just got out of surgery, Renee." She said, I know, Gordon. That's actually why we're bringing it up now. The house is too big for one person. It's a lot of maintenance. And with your health, I said. What health? I was hit by a truck. She said the market in Sudbury was strong right now. She said the equity I'd built up over 28 years was significant. She said Nathan had been doing some research and thought something in a smaller community, maybe a condo in a senior-oriented building, would be better suited to where I was in my life. I told her I'd think about it. What I was actually thinking was that I needed her off my phone so I could breathe. That was day 3. On day 4, Nathan called, not to ask how I was healing, to follow up on the house conversation. He said he'd been talking to a colleague who did residential sales in Northern Ontario and that the timing really was good, that spring listings were already being planned by serious sellers, and if I wanted to get ahead of it, I should start thinking about the next steps. I said, Nathan. He said, yeah. I said, I haven't been home yet. He said he understood that, but these things took time to plan, and he didn't want me to miss the window. I asked him how Renee was doing. He asked what I meant. I said nothing. I just asked how she was. He said fine. There was a pause that lasted long enough to say everything that neither of us was saying. Then he told me he'd forward me the contact for the real estate colleague, and he'd talk to me soon. I put the phone down on the table next to my bed and looked at the ceiling for a long time. That night, I couldn't sleep. Not because of the pain, though the ribs still pulled every time I shifted. Because I was thinking, really thinking, maybe for the first time in years, about the shape of things. About the house on Thiquette Street where Margaret and I had raised Nathan, where we'd had 30 Christmases, where I put in the garden she loved in the back. The raised beds I'd built from cedar planks the summer before she died, because she'd asked me to, and I wanted to give her something to look forward to. About how that house had never once been a burden to me. About how my son was calling it a situation from a hotel room in Toronto while I lay in a hospital bed alone. I thought about the will. I'd updated it after Margaret died, left everything to Nathan, the house, the savings accounts, the RRSP that I hadn't touched, the TFSA with about $60,000 in it. No conditions, no complications, just everything to my son, because he was my son, and I'd thought that meant something. I thought about Margaret, about what she would have said. She'd been clearer-eyed about Nathan than I ever was. She loved him fiercely, but she saw him. She used to say, Gordon, you give that boy everything, and then you're surprised when he thinks everything is owed to him. I used to defend him. I wish I'd listened better. The next morning, Deb brought me coffee again and asked how I'd slept. I told her the truth, that I hadn't much. She sat down and I told her what had been happening, not the whole of it, but enough. She listened without interrupting, which is rarer than it should be. When I finished, she was quiet for a moment, and then she said, Do you know what you want to do? I said I had some ideas. She said, Then I think you should do them. That was the morning of day 5. I asked to use the hospital's phone to make a few calls. The first was to my lawyer, a man named Douglas I'd been with for 20 years. One of those steady, careful people who speak slowly because he means what he says. I told him I needed to make some changes. He said he could come to the hospital that afternoon. I said I'd appreciate that very much. The second call was to my financial advisor at TD, a woman I'd worked with since I retired, to discuss moving some assets and updating beneficiary designations on my registered accounts. The third call was to my neighbor across the street, a retired teacher named Elaine, who had a key to my house and looked after things when I was away. I told her what had happened and what I was thinking, and asked her if she would do something for me. She said, without hesitation, yes. Douglas came that afternoon with a notepad and a quiet efficiency that I was deeply grateful for. We talked for nearly 2 hours. By the time he left, the instructions were clear and the wheels were in motion. The changes wouldn't be complicated. They would just be real. What I decided, the house on Thiquette Street would be transferred upon my death into a charitable remainder trust, Margaret's name in the title, with the proceeds going to the Cancer Care Fund at Health Sciences North and to a bursary program at Laurentian University for first-generation trades students. I'd watched enough young men and women work their way up on my job sites to know that those kids needed a hand up more than Nathan needed a windfall he hadn't earned. My TFSA would be split between the trust and a direct gift to Elaine's granddaughter, who was putting herself through nursing school in Ottawa and who Margaret had adored. Nathan would receive, as per the updated will, my truck, the one that had just been totaled in the accident, so effectively nothing, and a letter. Renee had wanted to see where I was in my life. I thought it was time to show her. I was discharged on the 6th day. Elaine picked me up. We drove home to the kind of gray Sudbury afternoon I'd known my whole life. The birch trees already stripped bare along the highway, the sky the color of old pewter, and I thought it was beautiful. I thought, I know this place. I built things here. This is mine. I spent 3 weeks recovering at home. Dev called once to check on me, on her own time, and I thought about what an extraordinary thing that was, to be cared for by a stranger more than by the person you'd raised. I asked her to come for dinner when I was feeling better. She came on a Thursday in December, and we talked for 4 hours over a roast chicken and a bottle of Riesling from Prince Edward County, and she told me about her kids, and I told her about Margaret, and it was the best evening I'd had in longer than I could remember. Nathan called me 6 weeks after I was discharged. Casual tone, checking in, how was I feeling? He said he hadn't heard from me about the house and wanted to know where I was at with it. I said, Nathan, I've made some decisions about the house. He said, okay, great. Do you want to? I said, I've spoken to Douglas and updated my will. The house is going into a trust. The TFSA has new beneficiaries. I wanted you to know directly from me. There was a silence. He said, you changed the will? I said, yes. He said, Dad, that's, and then stopped. Started again. You didn't talk to me about this. I said, Nathan, you talked to me about selling my house while I was lying in a hospital bed with broken ribs. You talked to me about where I was in my life without coming back to check whether I was still in it. I made decisions. You make decisions. That's how it works. Another silence, longer this time. He said, is this about me not coming back to the hospital? I said, this is about me deciding what to do with the life I built, which is what I should have done a long time ago. He said he needed time to think. I said, take whatever time you need. What he didn't know was that there was also a letter. I had written it myself by hand, sitting at the kitchen table where Margaret and I used to do the crossword on Sunday mornings. I'd written it slowly, crossing things out, starting over. The way you write when you're trying to say something true. When I was done, I sealed it in an envelope, wrote his name on the front in my handwriting, and gave it to Elaine with instructions that if Nathan ever came to the house looking for me, when I wasn't there, she should give him the letter and offer him a cup of tea. He came in January. I was up at the cabin near French River doing some repairs I'd put off for 2 years, the kind of physical work that clears the head. Elaine gave him the envelope and made him tea. She told me later he sat at her kitchen table and read it twice without speaking. In the letter I told him that I loved him. I said that plainly, right at the start, because it was true, and I didn't want there to be any confusion about the rest. I told him that I had been a good father, not perfect, but present and hardworking and faithful to what I promised his mother I would be. I told him that I had watched him become a man who had stopped seeing me as a person and started seeing me as a resource, and that I thought he probably hadn't noticed it happening, because that kind of thing tends to happen without you noticing. I told him about the raised cedar beds I built for his mother in the summer she was dying, and how she'd asked me once, near the end, to make sure Nathan learned what it meant to give something to someone without calculating the return. I told him I didn't think I'd done a good enough job of teaching him that, and that the responsibility for that was partly mine. I told him the door was not closed. I told him I was not interested in punishment or estrangement or carrying bitterness into whatever years I had left. I told him that if he wanted a relationship with me, a real one, based on something other than what he expected to inherit, I was here. I was on Paquette Street. I was not going anywhere. I also told him that Deb, the nurse who had brought me coffee every morning and sat with me when I was alone, had become someone important to me, and that I hoped he would treat her accordingly if he ever met her. He called me in February. He didn't apologize right away. I didn't expect him to. What he did was say that he'd read the letter more than twice, that he'd been thinking about it for a month, that he'd talked to a therapist. I didn't know he'd been seeing one, and that he thought some of what I'd written was fair, and some of it he wanted to push back on, and could we talk? I said yes. I said, come up to Sudbury, come to the house. He came on a Saturday in March, one of those late winter days when the snow is still on the ground, but the light has changed and you can feel the season thinking about shifting. He sat at the kitchen table, the same table, Margaret's table, and we talked for 3 hours. It wasn't easy. He said things that stung. I said things I'd been carrying for years. There were stretches of silence that were uncomfortable and probably necessary. Before he left, he stood on the front porch, looking out at Paquette Street, and he said, she used to love this view. I said, yeah, she did. He said, I'm sorry, Dad, I know that doesn't fix anything. I said, it's a start. I didn't change the will back. That's not what any of this was about. The trust stands, the bursary stands, the cancer fund stands, and I think Margaret would have smiled at that. But Nathan and I have been talking regularly since March. Real conversations, not the careful, polite check-ins we used to manage. He came back in May for the long weekend. Deb joined us for dinner on the Sunday, and it was awkward at first, the way new things are awkward, and then it wasn't. I still wake up sometimes at night and think about lying in that hospital bed on the 4th day, listening to the floor hum with the quiet machinery of people being kept alive, watching the ceiling and understanding that the people who love you will come and the people who don't won't, and that no amount of hoping will change which category someone is in until they decide to change it themselves. Nathan is deciding. Slowly, imperfectly, the way real change happens. I drive past Health Sciences North, sometimes when I'm in that part of the city. I think about the 11 stitches, the cracked ribs, the gray October afternoon when a pickup truck changed the geometry of my life. I think about Deb with her coffee from the good machine. I think about Douglas with his notepad. I think about Elaine sitting with my son at her kitchen table, watching him read a letter from his father. I think, lucky, maybe that word was right after all. I keep coming back to something Deb said to me on the morning of day 5, sitting in that chair next to my hospital bed with a coffee she'd brought from the good machine down the hall. She asked if I knew what I wanted to do, and when I told her I had some ideas, she didn't ask what they were. She just said, then do them. I've thought about that a lot. How simple it was. How long I'd been waiting for someone to say it. I spent a lot of years being the kind of man who kept the peace by absorbing things that should have been named out loud. Every loan I gave Nathan without asking when it would come back. Every visit I didn't push for. Every time Renee said something that landed wrong and I told myself I'd misread the tone, I absorbed all of it and called it patience, and I think I genuinely believed that was the right thing to do, that if I gave enough, quietly enough, long enough, it would eventually add up to something. What it added up to was a son who called me a situation from a hotel room while I lay in a ward alone. I don't say that with bitterness anymore. I say it because I think it's important to be honest about what happens when a person mistakes endurance for integrity. Real integrity. The kind that actually holds something together, asks you to say the hard thing at the right time, even when saying it costs you something. I didn't do that. And the gap between the father I was trying to be and the father who was actually useful to Nathan grew a little wider every year I stayed quiet. That's the part I had to sit with, not what Nathan did, what I'd allowed to go unnamed for too long. But here's the other thing I learned, lying in that hospital looking at the ceiling. Clarity has a way of arriving exactly when you have nothing left to distract yourself with. When the noise drops away, no job to go back to, no errands, no routines. What's left is just the truth of your situation and what you actually want to do about it. I had that clarity on day 4, and instead of talking myself out of it the way I might have done at 40 or even 50, I picked up the phone and called Douglas and made the decisions I should have made years before. That's what I'd call good judgment, earned the hard way. Not cleverness, not strategy, just the willingness to finally see things as they were and act accordingly, even when it was uncomfortable, even when it meant accepting that some of the damage was mine to own. And then there's Nathan, still figuring it out, still showing up, imperfectly, which is the only way anyone really shows up for anything that matters. I think what he needed, what I couldn't give him by staying soft, was the experience of a consequence, not punishment. A consequence, the natural result of having treated someone as less than they were. He felt it. It moved something in him. That's not nothing. I think about the cedar beds I built for Margaret in the summer she was dying, and how she asked me to make sure he learned what it meant to give without calculating the return. I don't know if he's there yet, but I think he's walking in that direction. And I think the walking itself, the willingness to keep going towards something hard and honest even when it would be easier to stop, is the most important thing a person can do. That's what I'd want anyone to take from this, if they take anything at all. Not a list of steps, not a formula, just this. The people who come through the hard parts of their lives intact are not the ones who avoided the difficulty. They're the ones who are honest about what the difficulty was, who had the sense to ask for help from the right people, and who kept moving even when the outcome wasn't guaranteed. Gordon is still on Piquette Street. The cedar beds are still in the back garden. That's enough.